So that year, I started with 8 to 10 varieties of various colored, various sized heirloom tomatoes. Slowly over the last few years, in the next year it was 20 varieties, then it was 40, and then this past year it was 70. So yeah, it does take hold, and I think, I do have to maybe curb this addiction just a bit.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story. I'm your host, Emma Biggs.
And I'm Stephen Biggs. We talk to creative food gardeners and farm and garden experts who break the rules and make new ones too. Have you ever had a hobby that grew? I've watched as Emma's curiosity with tomatoes takes more and more of our yard. But the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I was up to over 50 fig varieties for a while, although I'm on a fig diet now and I've severely pared back my collection. My neighbor Demetrius loves to fix bikes. That's a hobby that grew. It quickly took over his garage. As people in the neighborhood threw away good bikes and all those good parts with them. A hobby that grew into an addiction. That's a theme that we touch on in today's show. Today we head to Grey County here in Ontario to chat with Terera Zohorsky from Solana Garden. And what started as a fascination with unusual tomato varieties that she found at a local nursery grew into a venture where she sells transplants in the spring and tomatoes through the summer. We timed this episode so that you can get some tomato variety ideas as we move into the time of year when we do a lot of seed shopping and seed trading. You can find Terera online on both Twitter and Instagram under the handle Solana Gardens. So Solana is spelled SOLANA _garden, Solana _garden. And she's got some great tomato pictures that are sure to inspire you. Now, here's our chat with Terera.
Terera, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks. You're welcome.
We are really excited to hear about your tomato addiction. Can you maybe get us started, Terera, just talking about your tomato addiction?
Okay. Well, I'm a long-time gardener. I probably gardened for more than 30 years, not including the time I gardened with my family as a child. But about 10 or 12 years ago, I happened upon a small little country greenhouse, and they had an amazing selection. They were selling open-pollinated and heirloom varieties of tomatoes. So I came home with about probably 8 to 10 different varieties. I had previously only really grown red, round tomatoes in the past. One of the varieties was Black Krim, which I think is pretty popular and well known as an heirloom. But that sort of, to me, kind of signified was a gateway variety to my tomato addiction. So that year, I started with 8 to 10 varieties of various colored, various sized heirloom tomatoes. Slowly over the last few years, in the next year it was 20 varieties, then it was 40, and then this past year it was 70. So yeah, it does take hold, and I think, I do have to maybe curb this addiction just a bit. I'm probably at the maximum I can grow right now.
Okay, I think we all think that at some point, and then somehow it just goes by the wayside every year. We end up growing more and more and more.
I know. I said I was cutting back last year, and I actually didn't.
Yeah, I said the same thing.
It is a really hard thing to not, try that variety. Oh, I'm going to try this one. Oh, I'm just going to get a couple more containers.
Well, there's so many tomato varieties out there. How do you choose which ones get a place in your garden every year? Well, initially, I started just growing the tomatoes I could purchase. And then I started doing a lot more research. And, there's a few tomato websites in existence, so a lot more research reading about varieties. And then about 5 years ago, I started with a grow room in my basement and sought out smaller independent seed companies throughout Canada. So I just started researching and finding rarer and lesser known tomatoes and peppers to grow. And then from there, it's sort of increased to trades and swaps. So I probably have at least 200 of ungrown
grown varieties in my house that I hope to grow in the next 2 years.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and it really is a hard choice. I probably, I would say my grow list for 2023 is full, and 2024 is almost full. Like I'm almost 2 years ahead of myself.
That's neat that you're planning that far ahead.
A bit extreme, but yeah, there's only so much place and space in my garden, so I do have a lot of varieties I really want to grow, and I just keep notes of them, and I have notepads all over the place.
I wanted to mention, too, that you said that Black Krim was a gateway variety for you, and I think it was one of the first heirloom varieties that I ever grew, too, so I was excited to hear that.
Yeah, I think it's a more popularly known tomato, and it is a really nice tomato, and it's different than anything I grew before. It's black, purpley, brownish black with green shoulders. And I had no idea. I thought I didn't know when to pick it. So that's another thing about growing different types of tomatoes is just even knowing when to pick them, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're also different with different colors and ripeness that you wouldn't know maybe just to look at a Black Krim when it would be ripe to pick.
Yeah, well, I think that's a question that a lot of people who are new to growing tomatoes that aren't red have when they first get started. So do you have some top tips for how people can tell when a tomato is perfectly ripe?
I usually just do the field test. Obviously when you're buying something, likely you'll have a picture to go by to know what it's going to look like when it's ripe. And I've had a few customers email me partway through the season asking me or sending me pictures saying, is this ripe? Yeah, it's harder definitely to know with some of the yellow, the orange, and the green tomatoes, especially the green tomatoes. But I like the field test. If it feels like it's softer and it's not rock hard, it should be ready. And a lot of people do tend to pick tomatoes just before they're fully ripe, so they can ripen in the house for a couple more days so that they're not overripe when you're picking them.
I wanted to back up and ask you how much space you have, because you were mentioning that space is a constraint for you. How much space are you growing on?
I did have more space, so I live in a forested property in the country, and my forest over the 15 years we've lived here has slowly taken over. Everything's grown in, more shade. Started out with raised beds. I had some in-ground gardens, and I had containers, so I have like 3 options. Last summer, I took out most of my in-ground beds. They just have become so shady, and the forest is taking over. So I've moved to a lot more container growing.
You mentioned earlier that you have a lot of pages with notes about tomatoes. So when you're going through the growing season, what type of things are you writing down to keep in mind for the future?
One of the things I started selling 3 years ago to local gardeners at Fascination and the Thornbury Farmers Markets and through social media. And I've decided that I'm only going to grow tomatoes I tested and then grown here, so I know that there's different things I like to know when I'm, is it productive? Production is very important to me. If I'm only going to get 1 or 2 tomatoes that taste great, I still won't bother selling that because that's not going to be effective for anyone. So taste, just disease resistance, how well it grows in my garden. So those are sort of some of the parameters. Earliness is a big one for me because I live in a shaded property and I live on a high ridge. I really can't grow an 80 or 90-day tomato here. So I'm looking at the tomatoes that grow anywhere from 65 to about 78 days here. So I'm also always looking for earliness.
That's neat. So these are all varieties, the ones that you've now included in your business are ones that really you feel give other gardeners a good chance of success.
That's right.
I struggle every year with trying to fit in even more and more tomato seedlings in the spring, just into our basement and into our potting shed and then into cold frames. I'm curious to know, how do you take care of a ton of tomato seedlings in the spring?
Oh, yeah, that does take over my life. And it started out with, I just grew a couple flats personally for me. I started with lights in the basement about 5 or 6 years ago. And then 3 years ago, I decided, well, I'm going to jump into selling these just to give people locally an option to grow different tomatoes than they would buy a box store. So I'm right now I grow about 450 plants.
Wow.
In my grow room in the basement, and then eventually, as you know, then they move up to the garage partway through the season, and then they're in and out of the garage on tables I've set up outside. So it's a lot of moving tomatoes in and out depending on the weather, and it is very does take up a lot of my time, but it's fun and I enjoy doing it, and I like offering different varieties to people at the markets that they normally wouldn't get, say at a commercial greenhouse or a big box store.
That really is a hobby that's grown into more.
I guess one of the reasons was that my favorite little greenhouse that got me hooked on the heirloom tomatoes went out of business about 3-4 years ago. They retired. So I felt that there was sort of like a bit of a hole there locally, that people didn't have access to different types of plants that they normally would get from the big box stores.
And do you sell the produce too? Do you sell the tomatoes themselves?
Yeah, actually, So I've sold 3 years. The last 3 years I've sold plants, and then the last 2 years were at the markets. They weren't open 3 years ago, the beginning of the pandemic. They reopened again the last 2 years, so I've sold my plants there. Last year, I also sold my produce. Now, this year wasn't the best growing season. It was cold and windy, and then it was super hot and dry. And I think my tomatoes were a good 2 to 4 weeks behind, and I decided not to sell at market this year. But I hope to next year.
Well, from last year when you were selling at market, it sounds like you're growing a lot of really unusual looking tomato varieties, things like black crim. So when someone who's never seen a tomato like that sees one, how do people usually react when they find out that's a tomato that you can eat?
I did have little labels for some of the varieties so people could see what the varieties were when they were buying. And it definitely, with the green tomatoes, it's really important to point out, yes, this is a ripe tomato. Not a lot of people have seen or eaten a green tomato and don't realize, oh, I can eat that. It's ripe. It's ready to go. So that was a bit of a learning curve for some people. I think overall, they were all really receptive. I also did a mixed cherry box, like a cherry tomato and small salad box. So I would mix a whole bunch of different varieties in a box and kind of called it taste test in a box, so people could try a bunch of different tomatoes and realize they look different, they taste different, they have different textures. So it's just a good education to realize all the different types that people can taste and eat.
Coming up in a moment, Teresa and Emma get into some favorite tomato varieties. That's coming up in just a moment. A big shout out today to Wandering Walker on Instagram, who introduced us to Teresa, thinking that Teresa and Emma, both tomato addicts, would be kindred spirits. And you were right. A few more shout outs. Olivia, glad you're enjoying the podcast. Thanks for your note. And Olivia asked where to tune into the live show. It's the first Wednesday of every month, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, on realityradio101.com. Would love it if you tune in. And when the live show is taking place, you can email in your questions for us and for our guests. A shout out today to Shauna, who emailed to say that she enjoyed the article about how to grow olives in pots. And yes, you can grow and harvest a few olives even in a cold climate. And thanks to Edie for your note. I'm really glad that you enjoyed the fig and lemon master classes. So thanks all of you for being part of our food garden gang. We have a new article on the website just in time for seed starting season. It's an article all about seed starting lingo, all those terms and acronyms that you see on seed packets, in seed catalogs, and on seed websites. You can find that at foodgardenlife.com. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story, with your hosts Emma Biggs and me, Stephen Biggs. Now, back to our chat with Terera Zohorsky from Solana Garden. Well, Teresa, I know Emma's chomping at the bit to ask you about varieties, but before she does, I was just curious, what do your friends and family think of this hobby that kind of got away on you?
Okay, well, one of my daughters is super excited and interested in all the varieties I grow. So she's always excited at the beginning of a new season. So she's the one helping me pick out what am I going to sell at market? What am I going to grow and sell at market? And what am I going to grow and test for myself? And then she also has a community garden plot. So she's also looking through all the varieties I'm planning on growing to figure out what she's going to grow herself. So she's sort of one of my biggest cheerleaders. And also I was getting, been taken along for a ride on this tomato addiction. And I also like to test varieties before I bring them to market. So friends and family and people who pre-order with me, I give away test plants for people to try. So they're on top of, what they originally planning to grow. And a lot of people like receiving these interesting plants that they normally wouldn't get anywhere else. So they've, and I have a group of friends that I give plants to, and I sort of base what I give them as test varieties based on what their garden setting's like. So are they in town or do they have in-ground space, and what type of gardening they have and what kind of gardening experience they have. So I can kind of tailor plants for them. And I found a sleeper hit in the last couple of years has been a little cherry tomato called Sunshine Yellow. And it's not well known. It's not really, I've done a lot of research online. I really don't understand where it came from. I think it's from the west coast of Canada, the U.S., but it's been like it's a sleeper hit for most of my friends. They've all requested it. I gave it to them 2 years ago, and then they all requested it again this year. Okay. So it's exciting for them to be getting different varieties that they normally wouldn't get.
I love talking about tomato varieties and hearing what other people like, what other people don't like, what the weirdest ones are. So let's jump into that. Do you have any all-time favorite tomatoes?
Oh gosh, yes. I've noticed the Eastern European varieties do really well here. And it may be because we have super cold winters and super hot summers. I'm not sure if it's, and also we have shorter seasons. So I found Zoichka, Malachite Box, Krinkovich Yugoslavian, Black from Tula, Cosmonaut Volkov are all really great varieties that are super productive here. I also grow in containers, so I really have gone through a lot of tests with the Dwarf Tomato Project. So favorites there, Dwarf Scarlet Heart, Dwarf Lemon Ice, Sleeping Lady, and Mary's Cherry. And then the dwarf that sort of started it off, it's the parent for a lot of the newer dwarf varieties, is New Big Dwarf. Oh. And that's actually not new, it's actually from the 1900s. So those are some of the favorites that I've grown in the past that I've sold at market the past 2 years. And then this year, these are some of the test varieties that I grew this year. These are some of the ones that really stood out. Again, the Eastern tomato ones didn't disappoint. King of Siberia, or it's called Coral Sibiri. Altai Orange, Mavertanskite, which is an heirloom from Latvia, and Moldovan Green, which are some of the Eastern ones I really liked this year. Some really big slicers from the U.S. were Rebel Yell and Bear Creek. And for Greenland Ripe, I really like Grubb's Mystery Green, and that's a tomato from Australia. And then another green when ripe, but it's also an anthocyanin with blue shoulders that I really liked is Muddy Waters. And it's a little salad tomato that was bred by Tom Wagner. And he's probably most known for being the breeder for Green Zebra. Yeah, and then cherries. Oh, one last, the cherry tomatoes this year that I really liked were Rosella, Rebel Alliance, Sweet Aperitif, and Ambrosia Gold. So those are all probably varieties because I really like them this year. Out of the 70 I grew, I'm only going to offer about 15 to 20 for sale next year. So most of those will probably be sold next year.
Okay, well then people know that they're getting the best of the best and that they've been trialed before they get them.
Yes, that's what I hope to do. But then again, everyone's different, right? Your tastes are different than my tastes. So as much as I can sort of pick things that I like, and I got to say that I'm sort of partial to sort of the balanced tomato, not the super tangy tomato or not the super sweet tomato, but more the balanced, meaty tomato. So that kind of plays into some of my choices as well. But I do like to include other tomatoes that are super sweet, or maybe just have a bit more tang. Like a super sweet tomato I grew this year. It was a dwarf project one called Dwarf Pink Passion, which is a little pink heart. It was, so if someone likes sweet, I'll probably offer that as an option. And then for tangy, I grew Maya and Sean's Airdrie Classic, and it's a tomato that originates from Alberta, and it was more tangy, but good.
Well, I know I'm going to have to check out some of those ones that you mentioned, and especially the green ones, because I've grown some nice green tomatoes in the past, but not the two that you mentioned. So I'm going to go and check those ones out. And I also heard you mention Rosella, which was one of my favorites last year. And it's pretty, it's a winner.
Yeah, it's really pretty and tasty and productive. Yeah, I liked it.
I was just thinking that you two do have something in common when asked about favorites. It's not a list of 3 or 4, but it's a list of many, many.
Oh, yeah. In all kinds of colors and shapes.
Oh, yeah. It's impossible to narrow it down to just a few.
Yeah, I couldn't. I think every year I do a top 10, but every year it changes because I don't want to, obviously, I do repeat some tomatoes from year to year, but I do like to change up that top 10.
I'm hoping at this point now we've got some listeners excited about trying new tomatoes. And I was wondering, Teresa, if you have tips for people who would like to get into tomato growing a little bit more.
Well, I would suggest, looking for an independent or small greenhouse or grower nearby and checking them out to see, and maybe search out what varieties do well for them locally, because every local area will kind of have its own growing needs. Some tomatoes don't grow in certain geographies. So I think if you found out what grows well locally, that's a good start. And then try a bunch of different varieties, because again, you're going to have different taste buds than other people. So, try out different ones. And your garden is going to be different depending on whether you're growing in ground or in containers. The taste of your tomatoes may differ from other people's results. So, don't always believe everything you read or hear. It's really, it's going to be a personal journey that you're going to go on and, find what works for you in your garden. I would recommend too that, it doesn't have to be limited to somebody who has a backyard with ground space to grow a garden, but that anyone with a balcony or a deck in an urban setting can grow in containers. So the dwarf varieties have expanded over the last couple of years. So there's lots of dwarf variety tomatoes you could grow, and also peppers. Peppers do really well in containers as well. So if you're an urban gardener, there definitely are options.
Well, you mentioned a second ago some really great advice that people shouldn't believe everything that they see about growing tomatoes, and that their own tomato journey is their own. But for people who are looking for somewhere to get started, what are some of your favorite resources to find out more about tomato varieties and growing tomatoes in general?
There's a few websites that are strictly focusing on tomato growers, and one is Tomatoville, and the other one is Tomato Junction. So I read a lot of what other people's results are, and it's really good to know when people do post. A lot of people do post where they're located, so I can kind of help narrow down some of my ideas or choices for tomatoes or peppers based on their locale. For example, I've had done some trades with a Colorado gardener, so she has a similar sort of geography and weather pattern to where I live. So we've been successful in trading seeds, and what's done well for her they've done well here.
And you just mentioned trading, and so I think from those websites you just gave, it sounds like you can connect for trading. Are there other places where to connect with other tomato growers and trade?
That's primarily, it's through those sites, and also through social media. So people have contacted me through my messaging on my account. So that's another option, is to look for social media accounts where people are growing lots of great tomatoes, and you can connect that way. A lot of people will trade or do swaps.
Now, before we wrap up, can you let people know how they can find out more about what you do? And I know on Instagram you post lots of great tomato photos. How can people find you?
Yeah, I don't have a website. I've got social media accounts, so Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's Solana_Garden on all of those 3 sites, and there's an opportunity to contact me through messaging as well.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I've had so much fun chatting with you. I've learned a lot about tomatoes and about new varieties, which I'm so excited to research more. And you got me really excited for the tomato growing season.
Well, thank you. Yeah, good luck. I wish you well on this Tomato Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.
Okay.
That was our chat with Terera Zohorsky from Solana Garden. You can find Teresa online on both Twitter and Instagram under the handle Solana Garden. So that's SOLANA_garden. What did you think? Was there a tomato variety that caught your attention? As Teresa talked about Black Krim being a gateway variety for her, one of those varieties that took her beyond red tomatoes, I got thinking that I haven't grown it for a while. It's a great variety, and I think maybe I'll grow it this year. If this episode piqued your interest in tomatoes, tune in to the episode entitled Breeding Tomatoes for the Holy Grail, and in that episode we talk with tomato breeder Brad Gates. As we wrap up today's episode, I'm thinking about my first yellow tomato. As a little kid, I'd never seen anything but red tomatoes, and then I saw a seed packet with a picture of yellow tomatoes, and I had to have it. Seeding those tomatoes was especially memorable for me because my grandfather helped me to grow them. Garden with those young people in your life. You never know when you might inspire them. The podcast is back next Thursday, and we're chatting with a farmer here in Ontario who produces a wonderful winter delicacy, forced rhubarb. It's something I do at home, and it's something that there's a long tradition of doing in Yorkshire, England, so I was pretty excited to track down somebody locally who's doing it. Do you have feedback or show ideas? Or just want to connect? Find us at foodgardenlife.com or on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where our handle is Food Garden Life.
And you can find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca, and on Instagram as emmabiggs_grows.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.